Welcome to the Eureka Centre. Today's Eureka Sunday, which is marking the 169th anniversary of the Eureka Stockade. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Wadawurrung people. And the Wadawurrung people are, of course, the traditional owners of the land where the momentous events of the Eureka Stockade occurred 169 years ago. The Eureka Stockade led to male suffrage in 1858, but it was over 100 years until all First Nations people were able to exercise their right to vote in Australia. It's important to remember that on a day like this. And we pay our respects to Wadawurrung elders past, present, emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Welcome to Difficult Objects, Museums, Cultural Mediation and Deliberative Democracy. And today's discussion, I should say, introduces the ARC grant project titled Dialogue with Difficult Objects, Mediating Controversy in Museums. There's so many big titles here, I had to write them all down. I haven't yet memorised them, but hopefully after today I might have. And this is a project led by the three academics you have seated in front of you, Associate Professor Dr. Fred Cahir from Federation Uni, Emeritus Professor Chris McAuliffe from the Australian National University School of Art and Design, that's right, and Dr. Raquel Ormella, Australian National University School of Art and Design. This project positions the Eureka Flag as an example of a difficult object, so we're really pleased to be involved in this project as a way of developing new approaches to using art and museum objects in civic education. And I think everyone here knows about the Eureka object, the Eureka Flag, I should say, and what an interesting object it is with a great history of appropriation. We live and breathe this on a daily basis. I can tell you when people come in with their various views on what the Eureka Flag means to them at a personal level, but also they also believe it should mean something to everyone else as well. So it's quite a polarising object. It's a great object for us to build public programs around, and so to connect with this project is a great opportunity. So we at the Eureka Centre and the Art Gallery of Ballarat, and I don't know if Louise Tiggett's here. She's coming. We're project investigators, so that's where we come into this project. And Chris, Fred and Raquel will be engaging with the community in Ballarat, the community around the gallery and around the Eureka Centre to have a series of conversations, and they can talk to you about it today. But if you'd like to get involved, perhaps linger after today's session and you can talk to them directly. But I'll hand over to Chris first, who will start things off. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not, yeah, don't take Raquel's phone. Thanks for that generous introduction, and just to let you know what our format is I'll start out by just telling you what this large federally funded research project is, and then each of Fred and Raquel and I will give you a quick presentation about our interests and where we think the research might go. But because this research is very much about hearing people's opinions and establishing dialogues around what things might mean and how they're valued, we'll be asking for your opinions and asking you some questions along the way. Just to skip to the branding page, you can see that there's a lot of organisations involved in this project, and we're really excited as academics to be involved with the Art Gallery of Ballarat and the Eureka Centre, two organisations that are so deeply connected and committed with something we value, which is the idea that a museum and an art gallery can contribute to civic education, to our understanding of democracy and dialogue and community values. And I want to acknowledge Anthony Cam and Louise Tiggeett as they are bona fide partner investigators in this, and I think it's important that we're connecting so directly with them. The ARC, the Australian Research Council, is a Commonwealth statutory organisation which funds what they call the highest quality research in the country, generating knowledge and innovation for the benefit of the Australian community. So we're very proud to have received a significant 3-year research grant from them in partnership with Eureka Centre and the Art Gallery of Ballarat. Specifically, we have a grant that funds innovation in business and industry, and the goal of that program is, and I'm quoting from their guidelines, the problems addressed, the responses proposed, the activity and knowledge generated seek to enhance operations and impacts in an industry sector. And just to remind you, art galleries and museums are part of an industry valued at $1.7 billion per annum across Australia, employing 7,300 people across Australia. 20% of Australians will visit one museum a year. 50% of international tourists to Australia will visit a museum. So museums are really important places for understanding history and heritage and culture. The project addresses what is a pressing issue for museums all around the world, and this quote from a recent text indicates that what museums are expected to do is very different now. Museums do collect and preserve and interpret art and heritage items, but they are now expected to be an active part of the community, fostering inclusiveness and diversity, and engaged in the specific debates of our time. And in simple terms, museums are committed to that, but they don't always have the tools and resources. And in this project, we hope to develop some tools to support the civic education role of the museum. So why difficulty? The simple answer, as many of you know, is because democracy isn't easy. And you can see these recent quotes from two civic leaders in Australia, including the Prime Minister, indicating that whilst we can speak about a commitment to diversity and to recognition and respect of difference, we can't take that for granted. It's a job of work. It's something we all have to commit to and pursue. And we all know you just don't even need to open a newspaper. They're almost redundant. You just go on the internet and you can see the havoc that's being wrought against democracy, even around countries that helped invent it. So the ideas driving the project are relatively simple, but we need to work out how to hear from all the communities and build our knowledge around their ideas and experience as well. Include diverse knowledges so that the museum becomes a collective and community knowledge base rather than a place where experts tell you what the answer is on their terms. Sharing diverse perspectives so that what we can achieve, we hope, is that an audience, community, stakeholder input into how the museum displays, presents, interprets its collection objects will make for what is called in academic speak an extended knowledge event. And you can see from this slide that the Art Gallery of Ballarat's already asking its community to help it decide what's on the walls. Great first step, but who decides what those things on the walls mean? Everyone might have an opinion on that. So what will the project look like? It will be dialogue, it will be workshops, it will be conversations driven by experts in bringing people together around complex and contested ideas. So we are looking to apply methods from museum education and cultural policy and political theory, in particular, and I'll outline these in my next slide, these two ideas, cultural mediation, which derives from the museum sector in Europe, and deliberative democracy, which has emerged as a political model in North America and in Europe. And just to give you, this is perhaps the most complex that the ideas might get from me is cultural mediation as it's exercised in the European museum system assumes that the museum doesn't have a monopoly on knowledge, that other people in the audience, anyone with an opinion, with a position, with a memory, with a tradition, could come to us and say, you know what, that flag means this to me. You might have a different opinion, but this is what I learned, or this is what it means in my community. And museums need to take that on board as part of the information and the knowledge, not just an idea to listen to and move on, but something to work into the interpretation of the object. And deliberative democracy, very important. It goes to areas of difficulty and difference of opinion, doesn't try and resolve them. It tries to get people to, in situations where they will talk to each other with courtesy and civility and consideration and hear each other's point of views without it descending into a bad day on Twitter. It has to be a conversation that comes to, if you like, agreeing to disagree in a civil way. So those are the broad principles of this project and the partnership. But I'll hand over to Fred now, and he can give you a case study. And at the end of each of these little exercises, there'll be time for a quick question, and we'll have further questions at the end. Thanks, Fred.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome to Eureka Centre. I began my teaching career at a time when sessional teachers were employed, and you had to teach everything from applied maths to zoology. And I asked a seasoned teacher, well, you know, what if I don't know what I'm talking about? And they very wisely said to me, ask the students the question. That's effectively what I'm doing to you today. We have quite a very large collection of artwork, not surprisingly, at the Ballarat Art Gallery and here at Eureka Museum in terms of artefacts as well, including these sorts of illustrations that you can see on the screen that are contestable. They're contestable because we need to ask, I think, I'll use the word need, to ask questions about how we interpret these artworks. This is by way of example, an illustration of the first house in Ballarat. Even the title, I would argue, poses questions, and the subject matter, as it, especially as many of our artworks in the 19th century were redone, as we see in this illustrations and following prints and following interpretations of that artwork sometimes by the same artist, this one by James Meek, and sometimes by following artists, sometimes over a century, as we'll see in a slide to come. So these are rhetorical questions at this point in time, because A, we haven't got ethics clearance yet, so we can't sort of start the project in earnest. But B, because these are questions that we want to pose to the community, questions of this sort of nature to you, the community. Anecdotally, I'm a member of the Fine Art Gallery, and I recall this one standing and just sort of eavesdropping, effectively, and the viewers at the art gallery were discussing whether it was an Aboriginal person, and what the picture, sort of what the artist meant by this picture. Sort of was it a racist picture? Was how their conversation went along, and I thought, yeah, that's as a historian, I had interpreted this painting, and I had explored the artist actually recorded what he did mean by sort of drawing this picture, and various iterations that came after it. On your right is the original, and on the left is a touched-up version, if you like, done by another artist, and it appeared in a illustrated newspaper some decades later. So it poses all sorts of questions, especially in 21st century Australia, as to how we interpret images like this, how we want to interpret the plural as well. Interpretations is the critical issue in this research project. I suppose I've got enough grey hairs to remember giving a presentation about at the Eureka what was it, the 1994, so the 170th anniversary, or 140th actually, yeah. And then 10 years later at the 150th anniversary, and we had speakers at by way of example of the changing landscape, historical landscape, community aspirations landscape. We had speakers who were at, in the 1994 commemorative celebrations who had been at the 1954 commemorative celebrations. And the range of discussion about the Eureka events had morphed, if you like. Not surprisingly, I think, from topics in the 1950s that were burning brightly in the historians' minds and the community's minds at that time, and then the themes that people wanted to discuss about Eureka in 1994 were quite different, had changed radically, in fact, to 2004. All of a sudden, there was discussion, by way of example, about children or Chinese at Eureka or Aboriginal people at the Eureka events. So in the 1950s, by way of example, this illustration on the right was a given, if you like, and it shows exclusively male, exclusively Anglo depiction of Eureka. By 2004, there was these types of illustrations and these types of representations emerging into our community consciousness. So this, for me, these two of almost exactly the same sort of moment in time, if you like, representations from visual artists at that time. One having a convenient, if you like, perspective, and another one that has some inconvenient perspectives. The quotes, as a historian, I'm using not just visual representations, I'm also using the colonist records about Eureka in this example. So we see the design for a digger's flag, said William Howard in 1854, should also represent the native blacks flag, as there were several. These sorts of voices, these type of demands for greater representation, greater community consultation were being voiced in 1854. It is not a 21st century phenomena. This ARC project should have been done back in the 1850s. Emphasising this point, Aboriginal diggers at Forest Creek in 1852, when asked to show their licences, replied, "The gold and land were theirs by right, so why should they pay money to the Queen?" These are the type of difficult questions, the question that those Djadjurrung people asked the police hounding them for a licence, are the type of difficult questions we're asking the community to engage with us, to extend our understanding past our peripheral vision, if you like. We see these illustrations by William Strutt and Thomas Ham of Wadawurrung people, very much, and other Kulin people, very much omnipresent on the goldfields, leading up to the momentous Eureka Stockade event. And so these questions are becoming very much to the forefront of museum curators and art curators and the community at large. Should I, as a non-Indigenous person, be using sort of these representations of Aboriginal people and voices from non-Indigenous voices about Aboriginal representations? who gets to decide about this rather thorny issue that is now very much pervasive in our community as to who speaks for country is literally the expression that has become quite common in our vernacular. Ought we tell? It's a rhetorical question I'm putting out there. An Aboriginal Eureka story using colonial records of this nature. These are by non-Indigenous speakers and non-Indigenous artists. It's their representation of Aboriginal people, not Aboriginal people representations of their country, men and women. And on that note, I'll pass it over to Raquel.
Do you want to see if there's any immediate questions?
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, talking about questions, and I forgot to ask a question, a real question. Yep.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I was wondering about you were saying that there weren't Aboriginal representations of that time, but that wasn't within their perspective or culture in regard to painting watercolours or doing sketches. So how would you be able to access that sort of material?
There are representations by Aboriginal people sort of surrounding the goldfields. It's a matter of whether the gallery holds those Aboriginal representations. So the gallery and the museum have to deal with the holdings that they have, and if they don't have those representations, I'll use the royal we, we're faced with do we remain silent, or what do we do with these non-Indigenous representations that the gallery and the museum hold?
Well, I'm just wondering, the thing you were referring to, and it would be interesting for us as the audience to actually view.
It would be, yes. If the gallery or museum holds them, it would be terrific. Pardon?
I thought you were saying that they do.
Not this, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure, familiar with all of the museum and the gallery's holdings, but as far as I know, I'm not aware that the museum or the Art Gallery of Ballarat actually holds Indigenous representations of the Goldfields era.
Well, obviously they could let you know if you
Yeah. We'll be asking. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would have thought that they're mainly going to be in an oral tradition.
In a what, sorry?
In an oral tradition, that the stories would, if anything, documenting it from an Indigenous perspective at that time is likely to be something that would remain in stories.
Absolutely.
So they may not exist until somebody either had the chance to write them down or record them, rather than being a portable visual version.
Absolutely, and then the questions are asked. I presume the sort of following questions will be asked: how do we reconcile sort of Indigenous representations with the colonial representations? And I think it's a really great moment when we start to do that. Yeah. Thank you.
And there'll be time for more questions and observations at the end. I think those are all really interesting.
Thanks, Fred. And thanks for the beginning of the discussion. Okay. So, unlike Fred and Chris, who live in the Ballarat and Goldfields region, I'm based in Canberra and I grew up in Sydney, and neither are gold mining areas. So one of the ways I knew about the Ballarat landscape prior to coming here was from this glorious painting by Eugene Vaugirard of Ballarat as it was in the summer of 1853 to 54, so 170 years ago this year. As someone who teaches painting and as an artist, when I look at an artwork, I ask myself, what was the painter thinking when they were making this work? What pleasures and painterly effects were they using to deliver the image and the sensations to the viewer? So in this painting, I feel a hot day with moments of cool relief of shadows cast by passing clouds, sensations created by the warm yellow earth against the light washed out blue sky. It could be humid with building grey in the clouds. Like many of Vongeraud's paintings, we are standing back from the scene that is playing out below us. This vantage point gives us a feeling that we are in a vast landscape, the rolling hills and horizons broken by a single mountain with defined peak. There's a lot going on in the scene. And prior to developing this project with Fred and Chris and visiting the Goldfields regions many times now, my overriding thoughts might have been something like, wow, tents, turned into grand buildings, gold rush buildings, the big town halls of Melbourne, the big town halls of Ballarat. So once I started coming here and being in the landscape, partly to pursue my other interest as a birdwatcher, I really began noticing other things, like how thin-trunked the trees are, that there are less parrots here than there are in other areas of Australia, meaning that there are less old trees with hollows, and that in some places you can see the evidence of all the trees having been cut down and re-sprouting as multi-trunked growth, areas where the earth is mounds and gullies, and the most astoundingly of all, entire hills made of shale. Now when I look at the Vongeraud painting of Ballarat, I really focus on the details, such as the diggings in the rear of the painting behind the tents, and the many felled trees and stumps in the foreground. And in relation to our project, I'm interested in using a work like this to ask, how can a painting like Vongeraud's Old Ballarat give us an opportunity to discuss the role of resource extraction as being central to local and national identity? What is the difficulty this raises for a contemporary audience? When we think of resource extraction, we might think of the ever-present mining industries and the resources such as coal, uranium and bauxite, and perhaps we might stretch our thinking to the current forestry industry. In placing our project and thinking about difficulty, we want to take out and examine our relationships to the legacy of the gold rush, on the environment, on cultural landscapes, on country. What stories can we tell when we think about what it is to garden here now, what it is to grow food, to work on landscape regeneration, to protect biodiversity? How might these knowledges be brought to images like these from Vongeraud sketchbooks, with the large felled tree and a tub made of slatted timber, of tents and dwellings crafted with felled timber? We don't think of this as the wood age. We think of the wood age as being something a long time ago because we're industrialised, but yet everything we see in the goldfields includes wood. One of the first items we've been looking at is a sketchbook by Henry Winkles. So Winkles was an English artist who came to the goldfields for a year from 1852 to 1853. And rather than making paintings, he was an engraver. So he was someone who turned drawings into illustrations for plates for encyclopedias. So he made many drawings in his life on the goldfields in that year, possibly to sell to newspapers, possibly for encyclopedia illustrations. The Art Gallery of Ballarat owns several, as does the National Library in Canberra, and the ones we're seeing here are from the National Library collection. So not much is known about Winkles, however he is clearly very interested in trees. Most of his drawings use them as a central motif. So here is a felled tree close to the tents and broken and dead trees on the edge of the cleared area. And in this one, as uprooted bodies amongst the churn and turned earth of the diggings. In this one, we are right up close to the action, as if we were working as a prospector. And I find these drawings, all of them, quite compelling in their rawness and that they deliver the environmental destruction. There is no worker depicted in most of his drawings, and there's no human for us to connect with. We are witnessing to something that has happened, seeing an aftermath. So those are two quite strong drawings of that kind of depiction. However, the majority in the library collection are ones like this, and what Chris, Fred and I are starting to think of as portraits of individual trees. The details of the burrs and the lean and the character of each is distinct. When I looked at these drawings, I wondered if this is an individual tree that survived the turning of the country, does someone recognise it? Or do they know one of a similar age and character? So the last painting I'd like to show you today is this work by William Scott, The Brown Hill, Ballarat. It's painted in 1917, and not much is known about Short and why he made the painting. He seems to have been an amateur who did not make many paintings. And the work depicts the sky at a moment when the sun has set and the light is being reflected back up against the clouds. And while that section of the painting, the upper kind of half, is really well delivered and feels closely observed, as if Scott had looked at this kind of sky and wanted to paint it. And so it feels authentic, and more authentic than other parts of the painting. For example, the squat donkey, horse, pony that's drawing the cart doesn't feel quite right. Likewise, the composition of the curved path from edge to edge feels invented, as if the scene is experienced rather than a vista that is seen. Like he wanted to paint the path he knew rather than he wanted to paint the view he sees. However, I find the depiction in this vegetation of this painting really compelling, and this painting draws me to it each time I go to the gallery. It reminds me of seeing abandoned farming fields that have begun to become overgrown with blackberry, and the ways that blackberry canes droop and curl and form amorphous clumps that appear to creep and spread. The eucalyptus trees in the back are really thin-trunked as well and look like regrowth. So the difficulty we might discuss with a work like this is the ongoing legacy of the goldfields. What might bush regenerators, resource managers, gardeners, farmers see and understand in works like these? So does anyone have a quick reflection or question or story that you'd like to share now, or we can, before we move on to Chris's presentation? Yes?
Not a question as such, but I've done a little bit of research on William Short.
Uh-huh.
He is quite fascinating, and he actually had a son who was also a painter. I think it was William Henry
Mm-hmm.
Short. I don't have it all in my head at the moment.
Mm.
Someone that I've looked at. I'm the archivist of the Art Gallery.
Oh, great. Yep. Excellent. Well, we'll be talking to you a lot.
It came up on my radar because, well, I knew the painting intimately after 16 years as registrar, the collection. But someone in Tasmania was researching William Short and claimed that he was the same man as William Short, but his story and the number of children and what they meant and what they did in no way related to this man. It meant I had to go and dive into whatever I could find to give some detail to him. So I do have some notes.
Oh, great. I mean, in some respects, what's interesting, both for Henry Winkles and William Short, is that we're not burdened by a huge amount of biographical detail. And that...
We do have information at the gallery on Winkles, but no stories.
Yeah. So there's some, but in a sense, unlike Eugene von Gerard, who's kind of like a really, an artist of great significance and that we know quite a lot about, when we come to a work like this or the drawings, it's a sense that we're not trying to reconcile those images in relation to that kind of artistic legacy. And so I find these really exciting as ways of talking to people where it's not about, quite often museums and artists and art historians we're asked to deliver fact, we're asked to deliver a kind of expertise. But when we say, oh, it's not a lot, so what do you see? What do you think? What does it remind you of? Do you live here? Where is Brown Hill? What's Brown Hill like now? Those sort of questions can be really explored in an interesting way, because it's not, then we all sit in the same space. Those of us who are perhaps embedded in these kind of dialogues and histories, and those who might be coming to art and looking fairly recently. So that's one of the things I'm finding interesting about these particular examples that we're showing today. Yes?
Thanks very much for that. I thought it was very interesting in regard to myself. When I look at a painting like that, I think, oh, that's very interesting. I look at the overall, and it was really interesting to hear your looking more carefully at the vegetation
Mm.
You know, what was it prior, what was it then,
Mm.
and what is it now,
Mm.
which is really relevant. Thank you. I was wondering about the man in the horse and cart,
Mm.
which is interestingly depicted. What's on his cart? What are those? Are they just pieces of wood that he's cut off?
I think they're, yes, looks like some collection of sticks, like firewood, faggots, tents, pals, yeah. So they, and again, that's looking at it is one where I'm thinking it doesn't feel 100% convincingly depicted. And so I think, you know, it's a to me, the man and donkey is a kind of motif. Like it's there to tell a story. It's a kind of narrative. As an amateur painter, you know, particularly painting it in 1917, although abstraction and the beginning of a kind of modern view of painting is certainly well underway. Someone who, it's like he's painting something of his life. I think most amateur painters want to paint something of their life, something of their actual experience. And so that's why I feel like there's something in this painting which is not necessarily about representation, but is about telling a story about a kind of lived experience. And that's why I find the very curious way that the vegetation encroaches on the path. It just really gives me that feeling of walking through parts of the Goldfields track from Ballarat to Bendigo in areas where you're crossing private land, and the vegetation is sort of like the way that blackberry does that thing about kind of running amok, and you have to sort of find a way through. That is where the trees haven't grown. So yeah, I'm interested in what that might tell us about experiences of landscape. Should we move on to you, Chris? Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for all your observations. I think, you know, Raquel sort of hit it. You know, painting tells a story, an artwork tells a story, but every time we ask someone what they think of a painting, we get another story. And I think if you start listening to all those stories, yeah, a different kind of knowledge base will build up. So this project began actually, it officially began in August this year, but it really began 2 years ago, and it grew out of our shared fascination with flags. And originally the project was going to be flags, flags, flags. We had to settle down on one, and it had to really be Eureka, because we were interested in flags not just as emblems of belief or as national or political symbols, but the ways in which flags become the focus for people performing those beliefs, where in the way they display or the way they use a flag as a form of protest, or even in the ways they make pilgrimages to see flags. And that's why we decided at the official start of our project to make a pilgrimage to Canberra to visit a little fragment of the Eureka flag, the original Eureka flag, that a young man mailed from Ballarat to his father in Adelaide in 1912. Posted it registered mail, very expensive back then. He was determined that it arrived safely. And I'll show you tell you more about this item in a moment. We all know that flags featured powerfully in Goldfields protest and dissent. The Eureka flag, well, one flag to rule them all, shall we say, in terms of Goldfields protest. And you would know that there was a rich culture of protest, visual culture of protest on the Goldfields. In 1851, the monster meeting at Chewton featured a newly minted flag. To your left, the quartered flag that still flies at the site of the monster meeting to this day. And descriptions of this particular protest meeting include references to a brass band, to a parade, and you can see there in the enormous banner in the middle a bit of ambush marketing from the Melbourne newspaper, The Argus, which has the biggest flag of all. The 1853 red ribbon protest in Bendigo, by its very name, indicates the use of a visual culture of dissent. Those who refused to pay the miners' right wore a red ribbon or tied a red ribbon to their tent pole, and when the supply of red ribbon in Bendigo ran out, they started tearing up red shirts to make further ribbons. And all around that protest were flyers, signs on tents, and magnificent petitions, which in their variety of paper and handwriting look like strange artworks in their own right. These characteristics of performative dissent, songs, marches, dancing, poems, were imported from the British Chartist movement. And in each of these images, as Fred and Raquel have indicated, we get a sense of difficulty, a sense of the problems and puzzles. For example, if you look more closely at this remarkably detailed engraving, you will see, for example, that there up on the upper left corner, the leaders of the protest gather under a different flag, which I have not been able to identify. It's not the monster meeting flag, that flies elsewhere in the image. And as I said, the Argus banner is bigger than every other flag in the picture. And you can see below on your lower left, right in the very foreground, two black diggers are arriving, or are they leaving? We don't know. In the time-honoured phrase, am I waving hello or am I waving goodbye? You don't know until you get a fuller sense of the story. You can see, again, in the centre there, a Chinese man going about his work, looking remarkably similar to the one in Fred's image, to the extent that you wonder whether this was really an observed person or just a generic indicator of other kinds of folk being there. And then you also see, touching on Raquel's interest in trees, these viciously ring-barked trees in the foreground. Each of those elements comes into the picture. I might add, because I'm this kind of person, I counted 463 figures in this image, and there is not a woman or child to be found. And Marjorie Theobald, who's done the history of the Castlemaine goldfields, estimates that there were that about 25% of the population on the goldfields was women and children at the time. So the other difficulty, what's not there? Why wasn't it there? What can we do about its not being there now? Let me just, hang on, I'm rusty. Geez, I've lost my best slide. That's okay, it's not a problem. Here's where you suffer the dizziness of the PowerPoint presentation. I want to touch again on this letter. Another element of difficulty that we confront, particularly with the Eureka Flag, is that there seems to be a right and a wrong way of engaging with invested objects, things that we think are powerful in their meaning and history and heritage. Is there a right way, a respectful way to do it? A wrong way, a more disrespectful way of doing it? And who polices that? Who says what's right or wrong? So this fragment of the flag there on the right, an Adelaide Unionist, Fred Riley, visited Ballarat in 1912. It was a pilgrimage, and he did it the right way. He visited the cemetery to honour the dead, then he visited the stockade site, and then he visited the art gallery where the flag was on display. And to his horror and pleasure, he was given a piece of the flag by the museum attendant, which you know happened quite often. And on Saturday night, he held a street meeting and talked about his union views and wrote all this in the letter to his father back in Adelaide with the fragment of the flag. And he says in the letter, "I'm not giving it to you, it's mine." You know, so he made sure that there was no mistaking there. But he actually, his holiday was the perfect union man's holiday. And he performed the right respect for the Eureka Flag, except that he took a bit of it home. And he says in the letter, and I'm quoting specifically, it seems wanton sacrilege, vandalism, or something worse to tear it. That's what he said to his father. But he asked for it, and he took it, and he kept it, and it's still there in Canberra. He lived out a kind of moral difficulty. I went to Ballarat to respect the Eureka flag and everything it stood for, and then I vandalised it. So how do we deal with that? I looked at this as a museum person and said, wow, this has been in dark storage for so long. This is probably one of the best indicators of the original colour of the flag. And I literally asked the librarian, did they have a Pantone swathe so as I could match the exact colour? You know, you can't help yourself. But there's another story in here, a very human story. So back in correct order now. We also know, and I have to honour the research of Anne Begg-Sunter, who we spoke to very early in our project, and who was super encouraging and gave us so much useful advice. She's done a lot of work on the way that the Eureka flag entered into various left and political causes. And this is a beautiful object made, homemade in the mid-60s in Brisbane and carried by the two owners in over 34 years of protest against nuclear testing, for land rights, for nuclear disarmament. We would say this is, for some of us, an appropriate use of the flag, but we can't be 100% sure that everyone would agree. Lee White, one of the makers, said, and I'm quoting her, "Most Australians know what the Eureka flag stands for, that it was the flag of people who were fighting for justice," unquote. But does everyone's idea of justice, is that the same? And does everyone understand fighting in the same way, thinking of the various street protests we've seen during the COVID era? What are our protocols and parameters for the proper pursuit of protest and dissent and justice in relation to this iconic symbol of those things? Those are the discussions I think we'd like to have. When I was a kid, the Eureka flag had mutated into an emblem associated with Australian nationalism, and particularly resistance to American cultural imperialism. You might, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this one, but well, first you've got to remember Moomba, the annual parade in Melbourne. But in 1977, Mickey Mouse was declared the king of Moomba, the parade leader. And this gave rise to this protest that we shouldn't have this American mouse leading an Australian parade. And Blinky Bill, who had nothing to do with the Eureka uprising, I might add, would become the defender of Australian values. Such was the heatedness of this that someone smushed a cream pie in Mickey Mouse's face during the Moomba parade that year. And I want to ask you now, and this is a question to you, is there some kind of line that gets crossed? Is there a threshold of tolerance? The Eureka flag is available to anyone. It's not copyrighted. Anyone can use it. In theory, anyone can do what they want with it. Is there a right and wrong Eureka? What do we believe now to be the appropriate use? Would you stop people using it in the wrong way? That can happen informally. I mean, we've had these discussions about how the Eureka flag was a very popular tattoo, but after the Cronulla riots in Sydney earlier on this century, it was the most commonly removed tattoo. So, tattooists refer to it as the Aussie Swazi. So, what do we feel about that as a community, as people who have an invested history in that flag? And I'll just ask, since I've got some locals in the audience, when we were driving around, when we had our first meetings, I kept seeing the Eureka flag logo. After we met Anne Begg-Sunter, we were driving back from Buninyong, and we drove past the Eureka boarding kennels and category, and I thought, it's an omen, you know. But, I mean, Mike, I throw this over to you by way of conclusion almost. to ask, well, difficult objects are objects not only invested with challenging historical questions, they're difficult because what other people are doing with them, and questions as to what they really or ought to mean. And I think the most accurate answer to a lot of those questions will come from local knowledge, by listening to community values and opinions. And that's where our strategies of cultural mediation, talking about subjective responses, what people's own ideas are rather than the official knowledge, and talking it through deliberative democracy, hearing all those different opinions and not beating up on each other, but trying to understand why other people believe differently to us. So we hope to offer the Eureka Centre and the Art Gallery of Ballarat specific tools that will help them navigate those difficult questions and bring local knowledge and community knowledge in to the conversation. Our ambition, and why we're so proud to be doing this with Ballarat, is that we know that every museum in this country has a difficult object in its collection, something they don't want to talk about or they're worried about talking about. If we can find some tools and processes here in Ballarat, we can grow that across the whole museum sector. And we are already getting calls from people in museums saying, you know, is this something, we want to hear about this. But anyway, this is an unofficial research question. For those of you who live with the Eureka Flag, do any of these cross the threshold? I mean, what do you do when you with all this informal, unofficial Eureka-ness in your life? Just let it slide? Yes, oh, there's an answer, and I'll go to you, sir, later. Yeah. Oh.
And I feel really bad that I actually didn't know that there was a discussion in the 1850s about involving those Aboriginal flags in the Eureka Flag. I mean, how different would Australia be today if that had happened? And or would the Eureka Flag be adopted and owned, if you like, as the birthplace of democracy if Indigenous flags had been included in it? I mean,
and what was the Indigenous flag he was referring to?
Yeah, that's right. Because I was
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
I'm glad I did something.
Yep.
Yeah, and so we don't know what he was referring
Mm.
to.
And if yeah.
I don't think Indigenous people have flags.
But they were emblem. And look, just to parallel that, the report on the monster meeting says that the Chinese diggers arrived in a procession and there was a man leading the procession holding a stick with bells on the top. And, you know, I mean, I'm trying to find out what that might have meant and how they were adopting traditional cultural practices from China to mean something for them at that goldfields protest, and remembering that the Chinese then community used what it had learned in goldfields protest later in the century to try and receive civic rights and political rights in Australia as well. And, you know, there are deep legacies in marginalised voices. I mean, by the 1890s, it's 40 years after Eureka, but there are members of the Chinese community who are still using the lessons from the Eureka uprising and the Teuton uprising to further their community's interests. So there was a question up the back, or an answer. It's too early in the project for answers. It's Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And there's two directions that can go. Is like, if you look at 19th century trademarks, and I've got, because this is the kind of person I am, I've gone through the National Archives registration of trademarks. There's lots of Eureka trademarks in the 19th century, but they mean it in the old Greek sense that, you know, Eureka, I have found it, right? So there's that. There was another Eureka. And then the other more contemporary thing is that contemporary flag design, and this is the flag nut in me, often thinks of flag design in terms of it becoming a logo, because it's going to be on T-shirts, it's going to be on tourism branding. So there's another side that the idea of what a flag design is attaches to that ubiquity. Now, I guess my gut answer to your question is, I think our conversations are about rediscovering the real intensity of people's investment in something like the Eureka Flag, or trees, or the landscape, or family history, or, you know, all those things that give your community experience meaning, as opposed to, as you say, that layer. And remember, we're also doing this in the digital age as well. I mean, it's just everywhere and uncontrollable. And yet museums are meant to be exercising some kind of cultural intelligence and offering communities guidance as to values and history and heritage. So on a bad day, I think we're trying to solve one of the biggest problems in the world. On a good day, I think if we just listen to people, you know, we'll get some really interesting building blocks, yeah, to start this off. I mean, it remains, I suppose you'd have to say, what's the root cause of this? The Eureka Flag is a brilliant flag design. You know, there's just that. It is a really good flag. In flag terms. Yeah, I know Raquel's starting to worry now. She's saying, don't get him off flags. There's another question or observation, or...
What's the actual history or the design history in regard to the white cross
Oh, yeah.
on the blue background with the 5 stars, please?
Oh boy, there's probably people in this room better equipped to answer that than me. I'll just get that flag up. I mean, of course, there's no absolutely definitive, account of who really made it. There was and there are claims, right? There's this funny account that was published in a Queensland newspaper well after the fact, allegedly a reminiscence, where the fellow says, we left a meeting, you know, a Reform League meeting. We left a Reform League meeting and I pointed to the sky, I pointed to the Southern Cross and I said, that's our emblem, right? So there's that sort of Eureka, I've found Eureka, you know, moment. And there are others that are more anecdotal, that the women sewed it, that it was made from miners' shirts. And then some people say the silk came from bloomers. I think we could pull it back. Flags and banners were used extensively in the English Chartist protests, and there was a deep colour symbolism in them. There was also a quasi-military component to a lot of those Chartist marches, which was not meant to be aggressive or provocative. It was meant to show that they were respectable, you know, that they all marched in line and they controlled their behaviour. So I guess I'm saying the Eureka Flag comes together the way flags do, but we don't have a definitive answer. I'll throw you a curly one before I come to you. Just a curly one. There's a guy in Melbourne's done some intriguing research about the Southern Cross. Everyone talks about, you read the historical documents, the Southern Cross are the stars above us that tell us we're in the Southern Hemisphere. But what he found in a lot of migrant and 19th century diaries and letters home was that many people from England in particular looked at the Southern Cross and said, it's not the pole star anymore, right? So they constantly referred to the Southern Cross, not out of heartfelt love for the Southern Cross and for Australia, but to remind themselves they weren't at home in England anymore. So at that time, there was a lot of quite ambivalent meaning. And the motto of the University of Sydney is different stars, same people, right? So, you know, even embedded in that is a difficulty. Oh, right, we're in a different place, but we're still English. We're not anything else. We're still English, you know. Anyway, now you have...
Yes, so just in answer to why the cross, St. Alethea's Church near Centre Ballarat at the time used to fly a flag before Mass and representing the Christian cross.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's part of the answer of why the cross is in there. But also, I think with the stars, that idea of migrants coming from Europe and seeing this new constellation that they couldn't see in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's, I love that symbolism of this new constellation bringing everybody together in a new land. And I do think it embraces the Indigenous people as well in that sense, because it's something that's cutting out the British Empire.
But I would also, and I'm being a flaggy again, is the Brazilian flag has the Southern Cross on it. You know, you go to Brazil, the highest military order in the 19th century in Brazil was the Order of the Southern Cross. You know, so, you know, another way to ask this question is say, well, we're not the only ones who've got the Southern Cross. What are other people doing with it? You know? Or what do First Nations people do with the Southern Cross? It was meaningful for them for tens of thousands of years before it meant anything to any of us. Yes, sorry. I'll leave the flag up. That'll keep us going. Any questions and observations? And I should also add, before we wrap up, before I forget, is we do have a little sign-up sheet here, and if any of you want to give us your names and contact details, we'd love to see you in some of the forthcoming workshops and discussion groups. And deliberative democracy is about forming what they call in the jargon mini publics, like little groups who are representative of a community.
Oh, good one, Fred.
Oh,
like
Fred.
a classroom teacher.
That's right.
And I should say that none of this is on the test.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was interested in how you go about assessing community attitudes on these sorts of matters. I mean, you talked about the different ways the Eureka image is used by the community. I've only been in Ballarat 6 months, but I get a sense there's a real sense of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And we were here one evening and we wandered in to look at the flag, and there was a woman nearby who was clearly upset at the fact that the flag was here.
Oh.
And that she had to pay money to come and see it. Whereas when it was in the gallery, it was a sense that it was in a community space that she could walk in any time she liked. And I think it's a very interesting attitude, and I'd be interested to know whether that's more broadly held in the Ballarat community.
I can say, I can tell you've only been here 6 months.
Yeah. I was going to say that.
That's important, I think.
Yeah.
That sense of it's very democratic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking when you were talking before about how different has to go through a public circuit in Canberra. There's an act of parliament that says you cannot use the word Anzac, you can't have Anzac glass repairs. So it's a very different, whereas this is a hugely democratic image and sense of ownership.
So, I mean, my first reaction, and this, I'm just going into the deliberative democracy and cultural mediation mentality, is when you say how would you respond to people's opinions, I think the first idea is that you have to acknowledge that they have an opinion and seek to understand what it is they're trying to really say in that. And when your example is a good one, because I think it says, at the first level, it says it's about access. I want to be able to see this without any impost on me. Then I think if you go deeper, what people are saying is, I don't like the idea of culture and heritage in general being somehow managed, controlled, contained by other organisations. And I think just Fred and Raquel have heard me say this over and over again. An earlier research project on museums in Australia, 2006, and it did a lot of interviewing with audiences, and the audience response was, I understand that museums are filled with experts and that they have a whole lot of knowledge. I value museums, but I don't want them to tell me what to think. You know, and I think that's a really common, that's what a lot of people are saying is, I go into a cultural institution and I feel I'm being told a lot, but I don't get to talk back. And I think that's one of the, in answer to your question, some of the simplest things museums do is they just put multiple labels next to an artwork and say, here's what this person, here's what a 10-year-old thinks, here's what a trade unionist thinks, or whatever.
But just to acknowledge Anne's work again, Anne Beggs Hunter, who's with us, that she's done extensive writing about that shift between the flag going from the art gallery to this institution. So you should. There's a lot there to dig into.
And there was a comment or question.
Yes, I've often wondered what the 8-pointed star represents. I've never been able to find out, so maybe someone can give me an answer.
Oh no, it's the number of points on the stars.
Well,
it's fairly.
There is typically it's just the number of points is simply the measure of brilliance. You know, it's visibility in the night sky. So there's an astronomical sort of scale of brilliance, and the astronomically correct representation of the stars in the Southern Cross should be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're not all of the same. I think I've got that right. And in 1890, the Sydney Observatory took some photographs of the Southern Cross, and that really became the measure. So a real hardcore heraldry person would say a star shouldn't have that many points because it's a shape, it's an emblem. But quite a lot of people were arguing that that you should represent the stars as they were seen in the night sky. So that's my only kind of simple answer, is that 8 points just means it's a very bright star. Yeah?
But that thing about the number of points is mutable and keeps changing across both, amateur and, kind of official representations of the Australian flag as well as the Eureka flag. And sometimes you can date flags from that point.
Yes, and
Look, as a textile
Yeah.
artist, there's some real, what you're trying to do is avoid bias cuts on a piece of paper, basically. So the best stroke down the wall. That's what you do. I just wanted to...
can I just stop there and say that is exactly what cultural mediation is about. It's people just saying, from my expertise, here is my answer. I think that's fantastic.
I think it's terrific to have Raquel here because she does things with
Yes.
Yeah, but I didn't want to talk about that today.
I just wanted to say that I have been in the habit for the last 4 or 5 years of making small envelopes and putting tiny bits of very similar blue material, offering people a piece of the Eureka Flag. And I think that's one of the most brilliant parts of this Olympic story,
Mhm.
how it came here and all the back and forth. The other thing is, because I was here in the 80s, a number of businesses changed their names in the 80s to Eureka type businesses because Paul Keating abolished the fringe benefits tax, which meant that you couldn't go out drinking on a Friday afternoon and he said, put it on the company bill. Out of that came an anti-Keating movement by both ASBO and COSBO, the small business associations in the state and federal sphere, and they saw themselves as being taxed without representation.
Oh.
They used the Eureka Flag.
I was,
Now this is one, I was in the game at the time, so this is my view, but I'm happy to talk to you.
that is very interesting. Because this is what I meant before about legitimate uses of invocations of the legacy. Because as you say, as soon as you say no taxation without representation, everyone in the room goes, oh yeah, tick. That's they were swearing allegiance to that. They weren't swearing allegiance to the long lunch. They didn't know.
Well, maybe they were.
Well, yeah. That's those endless Reform League meetings. Yeah. But that is, I mean, I think that's for me. I mean that's where you see it with a lot of flags these days where this is just me speaking, not necessarily my research partners, where you think, well, you're waving the Eureka flag and what you're propounding has nothing to do with the values of Eureka or the union movement that followed it. Whereas, and I mean, I'm showing age, whereas, someone flying this at an anti-nuclear rally. I mean, they haven't confirmed it, but they said this was first made for use at a protest against French nuclear testing in the Pacific. And I think that is in the Eureka tradition of saying there is a power out there that is wantonly exercising its power over us without any consultation.
When you were talking about the meaning of Eureka, I have a very good friend from Germany who came over a couple of years ago before COVID, and she was shocked that the Eureka flag was regularly used because she had only seen it in context of very violent protests for white supremacy. And she saw it as similar to the way Nazi symbols are treated in Germany, and she was startled to see it used and to understand it had a different meaning outside of white supremacists and outside of the far right.
That is interesting because, I mean, on the one hand, she's coming from a culture where there's deep consciousness of negativity in flags and banning of the display of some emblems. But also she's only getting it off what she knows of the Eureka flag, she's getting off the bloody internet, isn't she? So, I mean, that's a question for us, and it's probably more for Anthony than anyone else in the room, is how do you defend and protect the integrity of that object and its ideas in this crazy world that we're in right now? You go.
Ballarat to do some documentary story and wanted to see the flag up close. And his question to me was, well, shouldn't it be the flag of Australia? I just stepped back from that and said, no, I don't think so. And there's obviously a thought he had, whether he went any further with that, I don't know. But I wasn't going into that discussion.
Can I ask why not?
Why not going into the discussion, or why not the flag of the country?
Well, it was representing the gallery. In the gallery, the flag was still in the gallery. It was an open place. Anybody could have walked in. It wasn't the place to have that discussion. And I don't know that is the flag that should be Australian.
And I think that's one of the things when we were starting this project that's really interesting about the artworks that the Ballarat Art Gallery holds, because they map that history, that they map a moment where I'm I'm born in the late 60s, so, you know, my consciousness of political life begins maybe like late 70s. But, you know, the Eureka Flag was certainly part of trade union movements. My father was a trade unionist. You know, all the kind of recessions and layoffs of the late 70s, you would expect to see somebody at a gathering with a Eureka Flag. And you see that in the artworks. You see the prints that are up going towards the toilets. That the Eureka Flag is mostly depicted alongside the heroic labour of men and around kind of the sort of manual labour that is associated with, you know, the trade unions. But it's gone through a completely different shift, you know, in sort of the 90s. All the works that are coming into the collection from that period are doing this kind of postmodern critique of the flag and asking questions about female representation, Indigenous representation, the lack of Chinese representation. And now it's come to this sovereigntist anti-vax. So all of these things are kind of contained within the museum collection. And what is interesting, for one of the questions we're also interested in pulling out when we're looking at the museum objects is, what is it for someone who was born in the year 2000 to see a work with the Eureka Flag from the 80s? Like, what do we actually have to tell people to make that work legible now? Like the long lunch, like we have to explain what Fridays used to be like in working life in Australia.
That's partly why it can't be the flag of the whole country.
Absolutely.
It's got too many now. It has so many layers of stories inside it that it becomes a vehicle to be able to tell some of those without having to be registered as the official. I mean, I understand that there were various pushes to government to make it be recognised as a national flag, but in fact that would then constrict it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And all of the history that it now contains.
Yeah, and what it doesn't contain.
Yes,
Yeah.
Talking about everything in history. I think I would much prefer it that it is remaining as an object, however difficult it was to be involved with its mood.
Yeah, oh.
That's my part of the
I think
No, but also the move to have it renovated. I thought you were talking about how was it called? Conservation that was done on it. That's an interesting story. Anyway, we not have time for that.
I just wanted to say, I think this conversation would go on for hours. Definitely be part of it, but I think we should give the opportunity for people that need to leave, if they wish to leave now, so we'll wind up. But anybody that wants to continue the conversation, come down the front, because I think we can have more of a discussion about how this conversation can continue over the next 2 years with Chris, Fred and Raquel. So perhaps at this point, thank our speakers and those who wish to say thanks. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
thank you.